It's an absolute disgrace and miscarriage of justice, and it's the same judge who keeps doing this.
American courts are known for being particularly unforgiving toward cop killers, but this is not always the case, as evidenced by the murder of Indianapolis police officer Breanne Leith in April of 2020. Leith and 3 other officers were responding to a domestic violence call at a local residence when Elliahs Dorsey fired multiple gunshots through the front door, killing Leith instantly. Her colleague survived, and Dorsey was charged with murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and criminal confinement for his actions toward the police and the domestic violence victim. During the spring of 2024, a jury found Dorsey guilty but mentally ill of reckless homicide, criminal recklessness, and the attempted murder and confinement of the defendant's girlfriend. He was sentenced to 5 years for killing Leith, which amounted to 0 prison time after accounting for time served and good time. The judge imposed a 25-year prison term for the other charges, which will be followed by 15 years of probation and court-mandated mental health treatment after Dorsey's release. Number 21. The murder of Devontae Mitchell. In a case that drew comparisons to the 2020 police killing of George Floyd, 43-year-old Devontae Mitchell was asphyxiated to death by employees at a Hyatt hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in June of 2024. The incident began when 2 women accused Mitchell of trying to lock them in the ladies' restroom while fleeing from security. One of the guards, Brandon Turner, pulled Mitchell out of the bathroom and dragged him outside with help from a guest. Turner and 3 other security guards, Devin Johnson Carson, Herbert Williamson, and Todd Erickson, struggled to subdue Mitchell before eventually taking him to the ground. The men pinned Mitchell down for 8 to 9 minutes while waiting for police to arrive, but by the time officers got to the scene, he had stopped breathing. He was never revived, and his death was ruled a homicide by suffocation. All 4 security guards were charged with murder despite their claims that they didn't mean to kill Mitchell, who they claimed had acted combative toward them as they attempted to escort him off the property. Prosecutors would later agree that the victim's death most likely was not intentional, despite Mitchell's pleas for help, which were captured in footage of the incident. Brandon Turner was the first to take a plea deal, agreeing to testify against his co-defendants in the event that their cases went to trial. He was sentenced to 12 months of probation in lieu of a stayed prison term of up to 2 years. Herbert Williamson and Devin Johnson Carson, who were considered the least culpable for Mitchell's death, each pleaded guilty to 1 count of misdemeanor battery. They were both sentenced to time served, enabling them to walk free from court. Prosecutors argue that Todd Erickson was the most culpable for Mitchell's death, but he also avoided prison time after pleading guilty to felony murder and was sentenced to 2 years of probation in lieu of a 2-year suspended sentence. Number 20. Rebecca Ruud. In July of 2017, an autistic teenager named Savannah Leckie was reported missing in Ozark County, Missouri by her birth mother, Rebecca Ruud, whom she had recently reunited with after leaving her adoptive family in Minnesota. Ruud told police that Leckie had run away because she blamed herself for starting a fire on the property, but some details about her story raised red flags. Acting on their suspicions, law enforcement went to the home with cadaver dogs, who found Leckie's charred partial remains in a burn pit. Over the following weeks, police uncovered additional remains all over the property, along with a meat grinder, lye, and other evidence that someone had tried to destroy any trace of the body. The very next day, Ruud hastily married her boyfriend, Robert Pete Jr., sparking suspicions that they were taking advantage of the legal ban against compelling a defendant's spouse to testify against them in court. In the meantime, investigators spoke with Ruud's ex-boyfriend, who claimed he had seen her punishing Leckie in abusive ways. Ruud admitted that she had forced Leckie to bathe in a pond and had made the teen scrub a wound on her arm with alcohol and salt. She also confessed to burning Leckie's body but denied murdering her daughter. At least 2 jailhouse informants would later testify that Ruud had admitted to drugging Leckie and throwing her into the fire, believing she was dead, only to learn otherwise when Leckie sat up in the flames and started screaming. According to this version of events, Ruud struck Leckie with a rake until she became unresponsive, but prosecutors were unable to prove the allegation in court. Ruud and Pete were both charged with murder and various other crimes relating to Leckie's death. After spending 5 years in pre-trial detention, Ruud was acquitted of all charges except abandonment of a corpse following a bench trial. In a statement explaining his decision, Judge Calvin Holden wrote that it is better to let guilty people go free to avoid one innocent person being convicted and going to prison for the rest of their life. Ruud was sentenced to 4 years in prison for the abandonment of a corpse charge, and the case against Pete was dropped entirely. Number 19. Messiah Booker. 21-year-old college student Dimitri Hampton was fatally shot in the chest in January of 2013 while trying to fight off intruders at his cousin's apartment in Flanders, New York. The accused gunman, Messiah Booker, caught a lucky break in 2017 when his defense attorneys learned that a prosecutor had failed to turn over a large amount of case notes, including evidence that others had confessed to the crime. In light of the discovery, the state was essentially left with no choice but to enter a sweetheart plea deal which saw Booker pleading guilty to second-degree burglary in exchange for a 5-year prison sentence. It was a far cry from the life sentence he could have faced if convicted as charged, leaving Hampton's family distraught over what felt like a gross miscarriage of justice. Booker was released from prison in 2019. He was still on parole 3 years later when he was identified as the prime suspect in a non-fatal shooting in Riverhead, New York. According to prosecutors, Booker fired at a crowd of family members who had shown up outside of an apartment complex to support a teenager he had gotten into an earlier argument with. Police found drugs and other evidence of possible drug dealing while searching Booker's car, and he was charged with a laundry list of crimes. In 2024, a jury found Booker guilty of second-degree menacing, 4 counts of drug possession, 1 paraphernalia charge, and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, which Hampton's family cited as a source of closure, despite the punishment being unrelated to the young man's murder. Number 18. Billy Southammavong. Alabama teenager Gage Taylor's life was cut short in February of 2017 when he was stabbed at least 9 times during a fight at a dirt pit in Mobile involving dozens of other high school students. One of the culprits, 19-year-old Billy Southammavong, received a lenient plea deal which left Taylor's family feeling failed by the justice system. The victim's loved ones were gathered outside the courthouse in protest when Southammavong pleaded guilty to intentional murder in November of 2021 in exchange for a 2.5-year prison sentence followed by 5 years of probation. While Taylor's family and friends called for an end to plea deals for murderers, District Attorney Ashley Rich expressed a far less sympathetic view, telling news outlets that Taylor had gone to the dirt pit with the intention of getting into a fight. Speaking to AL.com, Rich simply stated that it's essentially her job to look at cases from a legal perspective and that she does what she thinks is best. Authorities also charged a second suspect named Devon Watson with Taylor's murder, but the outcome of his case is unclear. Number 17. Mary Saunders. Late one night in October of 2018, 35-year-old Afghanistan war veteran Husayn Braveheart and his father, 56-year-old Wesley, got into a fight with a group of men in the lobby of a Harlem apartment building. The adversary initially fled the scene, but he returned less than a half hour later with 3 to 5 other individuals and resumed the brawl, which spilled out of the building and into the street. Both careers were stabbed in the chest and Husayn died from his injuries. One of the suspects, 41-year-old Mary Saunders, was initially accused of holding Husayn down while her brother, James Saunders, stabbed him 9 times. She turned herself into police and was originally charged with second-degree murder and gang assault along with her 3 co-defendants. Prosecutors essentially painted Mary out as the least culpable of the suspects, which earned her some major leniency in court, in addition to her lack of any prior convictions. The state also claimed that it was unable to prove that she knew her brother had a knife or intended to stab Husayn, and that she had only kicked and tried to punch the victim. Mary pleaded guilty to a reduced second-degree assault charge in 2022 against the wishes of Husayn's mother, and was sentenced to time served, making her the only defendant in the case to avoid a prison sentence. Number 16. James McKinnon. While working as the San Francisco District Attorney during the early 2000s, Kamala Harris prosecuted a defendant named James McKinnon, who brutally slaughtered a gay Vietnam veteran named Gary Lee Ober after the two men met at a bar. The killing took place in 2002 at Ober's apartment, where McKinnon stabbed him to death during a fight. He then placed Ober's body in the bathtub and left it there for a month while living in the apartment, using baking soda in an attempt to hide the odor of the victim's decomposing remains. McKinnon was initially charged with murder and elder abuse, but he caught a lucky break in 2005 due to a backlog of cases that Harris inherited from the previous DA. He pleaded guilty to a reduced voluntary manslaughter charge and was sentenced to just 6 years in prison with credit for time served, and he was paroled in 2007 after serving just 2 years behind bars. In his bid for leniency, McKinnon relied on a gay panic defense, a once often used argument among defendants who claimed that the victim's orientation caused them to become alarmed and react violently. Ober's loved ones disapproved of the plea deal, but Harris defended the agreement, stating, "Every case is different, with a different set of facts and circumstances." Number 15. Kaylee Ledford. In September of 2015, paramedics in 29 Palms, California, responded to the home of 27-year-old Kaylee Ledford, whose infant son had stopped breathing. Ledford claimed that she had fallen asleep on the couch with the baby, who died after suffering 2 cardiac events. But doctors noted that the child's injuries were inconsistent with her story. They also noticed that the little boy's ventilator had been unplugged while Ledford was in the room alone with him, furthering their already growing suspicions of foul play. Ledford had lost another child nearly 4 years earlier when her premature son stopped breathing. He had been on a heart monitor that was designed to alert the parents to this type of emergency, so they can take action in a timely fashion, but authorities had not observed anything suspicious about the baby's death. After her second son passed away, Ledford was charged with assault causing death. She pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in 2023 and was sentenced to 6 years with credit for time served. By then, she had already spent that long in custody, which meant that she left the courtroom as a free woman. Number 14. Shorbonia Poole. In July of 2023, 19-year-old Shorbonia Poole robbed a woman at gunpoint in front of her children at a Waukegan, Illinois gas station. He was initially charged with crimes that could have landed him in prison for 20 years in the event of a conviction, but he pleaded guilty to a reduced count of aggravated robbery and spent just 7 months in jail before being released on probation and GPS monitoring. Poole was still under supervision in July of 2024 when he was accused of causing the death of a local high school student named Valeria Rodriguez, who was struck by a stray bullet while eating dinner inside her Round Lake Beach home. He was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated discharge of a firearm, and unlawful possession of a weapon by a felon. But many community members were outraged that he had been free to commit the crime in the first place. Given the violent nature of the robbery he had pleaded guilty to, the judge denied bond and the case appears to be ongoing. Number 13. Lenneil Shaw and Shakiyl Shaw. 17-year-old Jarrell B.J. Hagley was eating at a Toronto pizzeria in October of 2016 when he was gunned down in cold blood by 2 hooded gunmen who charged into the shop with a shotgun and a 9mm handgun. He was struck multiple times by shotgun blasts and managed to reach the bathroom before collapsing. Prosecutors relied on one of several defendants, Winston Poyser, as their star witness in their cases against the others. Poyser testified that Lenneil Shaw fired the shotgun while his twin brother Shakiyl Shaw drove the getaway car. He admitted that he was drinking heavily and using drugs on the night of the shooting, and he struggled to tell the twins apart in court, prompting the defense to argue that his testimony was unreliable. The Shaws were nevertheless found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to the maximum term of 25 years to life. In an unexpected turn of events, Lenneil and Shakiyl won a new trial after appealing their case. Knowing it would be difficult to secure convictions against them a second time, prosecutors allowed them to plead guilty to manslaughter earlier this year in exchange for 10-year sentences, which amounted to time served. Number 12. Michael Guillory. When a 22-year-old paramedic named Bethany Walters was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana in January of 2016, police did not initially suspect foul play. The young woman's live-in boyfriend, Michael Guillory had fled the scene by the time the discovery was made. When police caught up with him, he claimed that the gun had accidentally discharged while Walters was playing with it, and that he had left the property because he feared being held responsible for her death. The manner of Walters' death was deemed inconclusive, but Bethany's mother was adamant that her daughter had been murdered. She spent 2 years pushing for justice before Guillory was charged with second-degree murder in May of 2019 at the age of 31. If Guillory had been convicted as charged, he would have faced a mandatory life sentence, but he pleaded guilty to a reduced negligent homicide charge in late 2021, which carries a maximum 5-year prison term. Prosecutors said they allowed the plea bargain due to a lack of evidence to prove their case or to convince a jury of the defendant's guilt. Number 11. Husayn Braveheart. 39-year-old Stephen Markey was shot dead during a carjacking in Hennepin County, Minnesota on June 11th of 2019. Police traced the crime to 2 teenagers, Husayn Braveheart and Jared Osman, who were accused of killing the victim during a violent crime spree that ended in a high-speed police chase. Osman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and is serving a 21-year prison sentence with records listing an anticipated release date of December 2033. Braveheart's case dragged on until 2023 when he took a controversial plea deal that allowed him to walk free due to credit for the 4.5 years he had spent in pre-trial detention. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of first-degree attempted assault, great bodily harm, and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. Braveheart was released in August of 2024 after spending 8 months in a residential program. Just a month later, he was arrested for fleeing from law enforcement in a stolen car. A jury acquitted him in that case, which meant that it was unlikely that his probation would be revoked. He was released immediately after being found not guilty, leaving some community members wondering not if, but when he'll strike again. Number 10. Darlina Ann Chilson. In March of 2016, 52-year-old Darlina Ann Chilson showed up at an emergency room in Yakima, Washington, with a quadriplegic teenager named Casey McDermott, who bore obvious signs of mistreatment. The girl only weighed 45 pounds and was covered in bed sores, with dead flesh extending to her bone. She was also suffering from severe lung infections, and one of her ears had nearly rotted off. McDermott died 2 months later in what one doctor described as one of the worst abuse cases she had seen in her 45-year career. Chilson, who had been her caretaker for many years, was charged in 2019 with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. While the circumstances surrounding her decision to neglect McDermott are unclear, Chilson's daughter reportedly claimed that her mother had been regularly using methamphetamine while caring for the victim. Chilson pleaded not guilty and was released on home monitoring as the case dragged on for years to come. Her trial was scheduled for September of 2024, but she instead pleaded guilty to a reduced second-degree manslaughter charge in exchange for a 23-month sentence. Because Chilson had already been on house arrest for far longer than that, she was given credit for time served, thereby avoiding prison. Number 9. Oscar Moriel. When a jailhouse informant shares information with the authorities, they're usually seeking leniency with their own case. 40-year-old California inmate and serial killer Oscar Moriel was no different, and his efforts paid off big time by shaving years off his sentence. Moriel claimed to have murdered at least 5 people, but he avoided the death penalty in at least one case by turning information over to law enforcement. He later weaseled his way out of a life sentence in 2017 when he was sentenced to 17 years in prison for attempted second-degree murder. By then, he had already spent 11 years in pre-trial detention at the Orange County Jail, where he had developed a reputation as a notorious snitch. With credit for time served and good behavior, he was released in May of 2020. Moriel was serving a 3-year parole sentence when he was arrested later that year on a gun charge. As a 3-strike felon, he could have faced a life sentence, but he once again turned information over to investigators while in jail, earning himself a reduced punishment. He pleaded guilty to the charge and was awaiting sentencing when he passed away in October of 2022. Number 8. Trevell Warren. 51-year-old John Christmas was shot dead with his own gun outside a St. Louis, Missouri supermarket in early June of 2024. He was killed during an argument with one of the store's employees when 32-year-old Trevell Warren approached him from behind and grabbed his gun out of his waistband A struggle ensued between the two men, causing the gun to accidentally discharge. Christmas was fatally struck by the bullet and Warren fled the scene but was later arrested in connection with the shooting. In early 2025, Warren pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and unlawful possession of a firearm as part of a plea deal, which was reportedly negotiated without the knowledge of Christmas's family. He was sentenced to just 7 years in prison, despite having been on bond for unrelated criminal charges at the time of the shooting. Warren had been accused of violating bond multiple times, yet the judge had allowed him to remain on GPS monitoring instead of detaining him. He killed Christmas just 2 days after being sprung loose. The victim's brother, prominent attorney Jarrell Christmas, vocally condemned the prosecutor's office for not contesting the 7-year sentence, pointing out that the outcome of the case would have likely been much different if Warren had shot a white man. Number 7. Duley Blake. 18-year-old repeat offender Duley Tyreek Blake was known among the authorities in Houston, Texas for his affinity for firearms, including machine guns. He had been charged with multiple gun-related crimes, yet he managed to avoid a felony conviction in March of 2023 when the judge sentenced him to deferred probation in exchange for his guilty plea. The judge was reportedly hesitant to go along with the plea bargain but agreed to do so at the prosecutor's urging. Just 2 days after walking free from court, Blake was accused of fatally shooting 32-year-old Robin Strong at a motel along the city's North Freeway. According to law enforcement, the room Strong was staying in had been rented out by a witness who was hosting dice games. The witness told investigators that Blake killed Strong as retaliation for a murder he believed the victim had set up months earlier. Blake was charged with Strong's murder, but the case has yet to go to trial. In the meantime, the judge lowered his bond, enabling him to secure his freedom just so he could land back in county lockup earlier this year on suspicion of aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. The repeat offender remains in custody at the Harris County Jail with bond set at $125,000. Number 6. Jamal Crayton and Joe Brooks. 22-year-old Christopher Harris of Chattanooga, Tennessee was murdered in late July of 2022 for making a sudden movement during an armed robbery. He was in a car with 3 other occupants when his friend, Joe Brooks, pointed a gun at his head and demanded money. After shooting Harris, Brooks and another one of the car's passengers, Jamal Crayton, asked the driver for money and then fled the scene on foot. The 2 young men were initially charged with extremely serious crimes including first-degree murder, felony murder, and especially aggravated robbery. If convicted on those counts, they would have faced life sentences, but they copped to lesser charges, with Brooks pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter in 2023. He was sentenced to 4 years with credit for time served and is due to be released any day. Crayton pleaded guilty to facilitation of aggravated robbery in September of 2025 and was sentenced to 6 years with credit for 3 years of time served. He was released from the Hamilton County Jail and transferred to McKinnon County, where he faces additional charges. Number 5. Gregory Maxwell Purvis. For reasons that one Canadian prosecutor later described as trivial, Gregory Maxwell Purvis kicked and stomped 42-year-old Derek Miles to death in January of 2018. The killing took place at the victim's apartment in downtown Halifax, Nova Scotia, after Purvis mistakenly became convinced that Miles had called him a rat in a social media message. Purvis, who is now 60 years old, was a known drug dealer with a criminal record dating back to 1983. He already had 29 prior convictions under his belt before killing Miles and had been released from prison just a year earlier after serving time for stabbing someone in the neck. Despite his checkered history, Purvis managed to avoid a murder conviction for Miles' death, instead pleading guilty to manslaughter in July of 2025. He was sentenced to time served and released from custody. Prosecutors accepted a manslaughter plea due to unsavory witnesses who became increasingly uncooperative with the case, which would have made it difficult to prove a murder charge. Purvis declined to speak with reporters as he loaded his belongings into a pickup truck outside the courthouse and drove away a free man. Number 4. Billy Dupree. In December of 2014, 16-year-old Alicia Kelly was murdered in Kansas City, Kansas, and dumped near an abandoned building in neighboring Kansas City. Missouri. The investigation into her death dragged on for 9 long years before authorities finally charged the suspect, Billy Dupree, with first-degree murder in 2023. Dupree has a lengthy criminal history dating back to the early 2000s, when he was convicted of 2 separate crimes against minors. As news of the 39-year-old's arrest for Kelly's murder broke, news outlets were quick to reveal that he's the nephew of Wyandotte County Prosecutor Mark Dupree, in what Kelly's family described as a literal spit on the victim's grave. Dupree avoided a trial at the 11th hour by pleading no contest to a reduced involuntary manslaughter in September of 2024. Had he been convicted as charged, he would have faced a life sentence, but records show that Dupree could be released from prison as early as 2035. Dupree's uncle denied playing any role in the outcome of the case, but Kelly's loved ones continue to harbor suspicions to the contrary after learning about the plea deal. Number 3. Christine Satriano. In July of 2022, an employee at the Ramsey County Jail in Minnesota was accused of aiding a murder suspect by tipping him off that someone had been talking. 54-year-old Christine Satriano was charged with aiding 28-year-old Della Kay Williams, who was suspected of killing 31-year-old Regis Jones in St. Paul's Frogtown neighborhood 3 months earlier. According to court documents, Jones's murder was carried out in an attempt to cover up a previous homicide that had taken place about a month earlier. While in county lockup, he and Satriano engaged in numerous explicit and incriminating phone calls with one another. After listening to the conversations, investigators discovered notes that Williams had written to Satriano asking her to pass information on to his co-defendants and people outside the jail. Satriano reportedly admitted to the inappropriate relationship and to passing on the name of the person who was supposedly talking about the case, thereby putting that individual in danger. She pleaded guilty to a felony charge of aiding an offender and could have served prison time for it, but was sentenced to time served for the 4 months she had spent in pre-trial detention. As part of the deal, Satriano agreed to testify against Williams, who was found guilty and sentenced to life behind bars. Number 2. William Johnson. In one of the more unusual cases on today's list, former U.S. Army soldiers Jacob Maziaika, Justin Causey, and William Lyle Johnson were accused of acting as paid assassins in the murder of a struggling German farmer named Thomas Schwartz, who was killed in the Netherlands in 2019. Dutch police discovered the victim's bound and slashed body while responding to a call about the front door of his Bergen home being left open. According to prosecutors, the trio of hitmen had been hired by Swiss businessman Lucas Fecker, who the victim owed money to. Investigators traced the murder to Fecker, Causey, Maziaika, and Johnson through encrypted messages and a rental car containing traces of blood evidence. By the time the American suspects were charged, they had returned to the United States. They were extradited to the Netherlands, where they were all found guilty of their roles in the killing and sentenced to varying prison terms of up to 17.5 years. William Lyle Johnson, a former sheriff's deputy from Mississippi, received the lightest sentence of 1.5 years with credit for time served, enabling him to avoid any initial time behind bars. Number 1. Joe Atkinson. In 2018, 24-year-old Poppy Devi Waterhouse broke up with her boyfriend, 25-year-old Joe Atkinson, but the two continued to live together at their shared flat in Leeds, England, while they figured out their next steps. They both started seeing other people, but Atkinson couldn't accept that the relationship was over. He reached his breaking point on a December evening when he returned home from a night out drinking and stabbed Waterhouse 70 times with a kitchen knife while she talked on the phone with her new boyfriend. Atkinson called the police several hours later after attempting to clean the crime scene and throwing away his bloody clothes. Prosecutors accused him of attacking Waterhouse in an unprovoked, jealous rage, despite his initial claim that he had acted in self-defense. And in April of 2019, Atkinson pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years and 310 days, sparking ongoing efforts among advocates to increase the minimum sentence for domestic violence-related murders. Thanks for watching. Suppose you could ensure 99 killers who evaded punishment were sentenced to life, but one innocent person would also be jailed for life as a consequence. Would you do it? Why or why not?